Hello, Sadaf. Thank you for coming.
Hi, Astra. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. When we connected and you said what you're doing, um, I found it so unique that I just wanted to just continue this conversation, learn more about what it is, how do you get into that, stuff like that. So you're registered dietitian, and but I want you to explain because I don't think that what you do is maybe how can I say it? The normal thing that people perceive as dietitian is doing, or, like, because when you explain it, I'm like, wait, is this something that dietitians do? Or like, how does it look like? So maybe can you describe, well, maybe first describe what is it that you actually do, or how does it look like?
Yeah, so I mean, dietitians, like the title suggests, are folks that are trained in providing medical nutrition therapy for folks who want to manage, chronic disease, lose weight, build self-esteem,
Yeah.
confidence, all those great things. Um, you have the traditional Western way of applying dietetics to improve
Hmm.
people's lives. And then you have the functional and integrative way, which looks at the root cause of chronic disease, and autoimmune issues, which is one of my interests,
Hmm.
and looking to address the problem right at the root rather than just symptom management. And so my approach to it is to really get to the root and look at the genetics of the
Hmm.
individual. What could be more basic than what's happening on the cellular level, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a very new field, and I understand that, lots of more research needs to be done, discoveries need to be made, but there's no reason why we can't apply what we've learned already. And so I've already taken the initiative and started to implement, some genetic testing along with the functional labs that some of the bigger diagnostic companies offer. So it's a combination of things, and I think that's what makes my approach really unique because I'm using this uh, multifaceted approach, right, along with behavioral component, which is
Hmm.
a very big part of getting people to make those changes in their lifestyle. Like, we can get the genetic test, but now if the individual is not motivated to carry out the recommendations, now I have to look and see, all right, well, how do I get this person on board? How can I engage them? And how can I do that? Well, one, dietitians are trained in motivational interviewing, but I also do have 15 years of experience in the mental health background where I worked as a behavior therapist.
Hmm.
My first degree was in psychology, and I went on and got my master's in healthcare management and policy. And yeah, and then I decided that when I saw that there was a connection between mental health and nutrition, and there was a big divide there, I decided to make a career change and bring this kind of unique approach to folks who are really looking for meaningful changes to their lives.
Okay, so there's many things that we can cover here. Maybe one thing that I would want to start with is, how did you get into psychology, or how did that start?
I think it was just kind of one of those things. I was starting college and looking at a number of majors. The university that I was attending, which is Stony Brook University, they have a amazing psychology program, undergraduate, and they also do research and they have a doctoral program. And because it was such a well-known school for that, and I had an interest, I had taken some introductory courses to psychology. I was very intrigued by how the brain functions, how human behavior is impacted by, nurture versus
Yeah.
nature, the basic nurture versus nature thing. And so I decided to pursue a bachelor of science in that. eventually ended up working in the field 15 years because I mean, I just loved working with the population. I worked primarily with children with autism and
Mhm.
developmental delays. And then eventually I worked my way into working with adults with psychiatric disabilities.
Mhm.
And I worked on the, coaching side. And then I also worked on the administrative side of things. So I'm
So
pretty,
what is the coaching and administrative side? Can you explain them a bit?
yeah. So the coaching is basically helping folks establish goals,
Yeah.
smart goals, and helping them overcome those goals by managing their behaviors, working with population with developmental delays or autism, it's a little bit different from working, with folks who
Yeah.
do not have a diagnosis, right? So we look at baseline behaviors and then see what kind of modifications we can make. And then the treatment team and the staff that works individually with these folks can implement the recommendations to bring about long-term behavioral changes. So for example, if somebody is, engaging in self-injurious behaviors, how can we work to reduce those behaviors and hopefully maybe even eventually, eliminate them altogether. But for some, that may not be feasible. We can just improve it along with their medical doctors and medication management, and certainly nutrition plays a big part in that as well. Um, and then the administrative side of things is just that kind of boring stuff,
Oh, okay.
making sure that all the documentation is correct, that we have, if there's incidents, we're recording, investigating for billing purposes and that kind of stuff.
Okay, so even when it comes to self-harm, that is something that um in the previous podcast episode, I was talking with my guest about self-love and self-hate, and how a lot of times when we set certain goals, we don't necessarily set them out of self-love, we set them out of self-hate because you don't like where you are, you hate where you are. And because you mentioned self-harm, that is something that for me it was like a light bulb. Self-hate, that was the first thought that came to my mind. Do you know, maybe when it comes to this topic, what is it that gets people to a place where they get this like self-hate? Because that's a really strong negative place to be.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's so many reasons for that, right? Um, with social media now, I think that's a big factor that maybe didn't exist in the 90s and 80s.
Yeah.
Kids growing up and adults even didn't have this constant stimulation to artificial um, portrayal of people's
Yeah.
lives. I mean, yes, there were magazines and there was TV, but to a great extent, it was very limited. It wasn't this 24-hour in the palm
Yeah.
of our hand access to millions and millions of people. And most people are portraying, a very filtered lifestyle.
Yeah.
And I think that has a real negative impact on not only children, but adults as well. And it creates this false sense of I'm not good enough, right? And and that certainly can also stem from, the very much bigger issues also like, socioeconomic status, education level, um, trauma that folks have experienced from abuse, all kinds of abuse, neglect from their parents. There's just so many reasons why a person might feel that they're not good enough and start
Yeah.
to, project that inwards, that they're not good enough, and that self-hate starts to manifest in a number of injurious ways, right? Whether it's through binging or emotional eating or gambling, or I mean, there's so many things that a person can
Yeah.
engage in to inflict harm on themselves. So I think it's important to, as a provider, to, when you're working with an individual, to sort of be able to pick up on these things or ask those important questions to extract information so
Yeah.
that, we can refer them to the appropriate people who are, trained to deal with mental health issues on a more, individualistic basis. Like, I'm a dietitian. I do have a
Yeah.
extensive background in mental health, but now it would be really outside of my scope
Yeah.
to work within the mental health field exclusively. So my job is to ask the important questions and then refer out so that the person has a more well-rounded treatment team and we can help them get to their goals, and to bring that quality of life that I think
Yeah.
most people are looking to gain.
Yeah. Okay, so as you were speaking about binging and gambling, one thing that I wrote down was escapism. That I have noticed, not even because I haven't worked with that population, but when it comes to several things that also times we know in our lives that we know we need to have addressed. We not everybody, but a lot of people tend to kind of start to go towards this escapism, sit on the phone, or I don't know, go gambling, do something else. It can be really anything. And instead of addressing it, which is a lot of times that addressing piece, technically speaking, isn't actually that hard. But that process or emotion that's involved in actually addressing it, where we rather, usually I describe it as we all have or assume that other people have in their houses one room that when you have guests coming over, you put all the stuff in that room. That room gets closed off, light off, and it stays there. And that's what a lot of times we deal with certain thoughts or certain situations, something like that. We just put it there and we turn the light off and we actually don't want to look at it. We just put it there. Even though we know it's there, and most of the time we actually have to look there, we will have to resolve it or clean it out at some point, but we rather not look at it. But at the same time, what I have noticed is that starting to look at it actually might be one of the hardest bits of it, because then when you start to look at it and you start to get comfortable looking at it, you can actually resolve it, because it's really hard to resolve something that you're not looking at. You know it's there, but at the same time you want to keep your distance, stuff like that. But starting to actually address it, that's something that I feel is something that even in myself, I have noticed with several things that I have worked on myself, that I feel this like big resistance towards it. But then when I start to work on it, I'm like, oh, actually it's not that bad. You know, like where that resistance is coming from.
I think it's probably just, and this is my personal
Yeah.
opinion. I think it's really just, a comfort, level of comfort, human nature
Yeah.
is to look for the easiest path, right? Like the most comfortable spot. And
Yeah.
dealing with those tough thoughts it's not fun. It's,
Yeah.
it brings pain, it brings unease. And I think folks who are ready to make the change, who understand, who may have, in a sense, hit rock bottom, and there's no way but up, are ready to, take on those big
Yeah.
challenges and face it. But most people are in a place of comfort. And, when you're comfortable, there's no motivation to improve or deal with, any bigger issues, right? Like
Yeah.
even with the job, most of us tend to become very comfortable and, complacent. And we're like, I'm I'm going to work. I know what to expect. I have my routine. Why should I disrupt that in any way?
Yeah.
And I think internally, psychologically, it's the same thing, like, why should I really have to deal with that when I'm okay? I'm surviving. And I think that's the important thing. We don't want to just be surviving. We want to thrive, whether it's going and getting the mental, approaching the mental health from the point of, hey, do I need to look to speak to a therapist? Do I
Yeah.
need medication? Engaging in physical activity, having healthy relationships, looking to eliminate toxic
Yeah.
relationships, because we all have encountered that in some way, right? Whether we have a boss who's not doing right by us, or a family member, or a friend, or a spouse, partner. I mean, there's always somebody.
Yeah.
And so we have to be actively working. And I think people just get comfortable, like, if this person is here, let them just be here. I deal with them when I deal with them, and that's pretty much it. But it has a big impact on us. We carry this, it becomes very much a part of our being. And so we have to actively work to eliminate go into the room,
Yeah.
turn on the light, clean out all the stuff, and use it for better stuff,
Yeah.
right? Like turn it into something productive. But it takes effort. And
Yeah.
most people, like I
And
said, are,
time.
and time. Yeah. And it takes a long time. These are not
Yeah.
things that, you can fix in a week or in a month. Sometimes it takes years. But I think the point is that we start to first have the awareness, right? To be
Yeah.
able to self-reflect, have the insight, and then to take those steps to work all these issues out and go from just surviving, being comfortable, to having some kind of quality and thrive,
Yeah.
and whatever that means for that person.
Yeah.
Sometimes it just means getting rid of a toxic relationship, right? And you just automatically start to feel like, I feel better
Yeah.
now. Things are good. Okay, now I can, try other
Yeah.
things, meet other people. So I don't
Yeah.
know if that answered your question.
Again, that's one common thing, is that a lot of times I tend to be so focused on what you're saying that I forget the question. So um
Yeah. The
but
question was, yeah, I mean, like, how to get past, how do you address the,
oh yeah, yeah. Actually, as you were speaking, one interesting thing that like is what I jumped in saying about the time, that's I think something that can be connected to that self-hate as well, living in a world where we have this not only we compare our normal selves to the selves that others project online as their perfect selves, but also the fact that most of the things we can get instantly. Want to watch a movie? 1 minute you can watch it. Want to get a delivery? Most of the times, even now, you can get it within a day. That same day you can get it. But then when it comes to results, that's something that actually takes time. And I think because we can get everything so quickly, we are now losing this sense of like maybe even patience, that things take time. So when it comes to results, you will not get them even within a month, or sometimes even a year, depending on result that you want to get. But that patience piece and being able to stick with it, especially through that beginning phase where you don't really see any visible result or any feedback that this is working. These steps that I'm taking, they're making this big change that I'm expecting, which is another thing that I have noticed, is that when we want to start to change something in our lives, we want to start with some like big steps, big change. I will start to, like, now the New Year's resolution time is slowly approaching. So a lot of people will set these big goals for themselves, which I have nothing against big goals, but I rather would have people to set goals that are sustainable, because then if you can sustain it, you can actually sustain that change. And the longer you can sustain it, the stronger it actually becomes. So now it can become like part of your routine. And that's where you actually get the real results. Not with how big are the steps that you're taking, but how long you're actually able to take the steps that you're taking. Because that consistency is where you slowly start to build up. Not only those things start to add up, but also you build up your ability to tolerate doing more and more, or actually taking bigger and bigger steps. But you have to start with those tiny, small baby steps that you take on a daily basis. But speaking of diets, nutrition, stuff like that. So how did you go from psychology, which you kind of touched on the link between mental health, nutrition, but how did you go from that to from psychology to nutrition, because that is, I don't think it's like a common direction to go.
No, it's not. To be honest, it was my own personal health journey. I had been suffering from brain fog for as long as I can remember from childhood. And I had pediatricians telling my parents that my hair was tied too tight, my ponytail was too tight, my headband was too tight. And, I thought it was odd, even as a child, that this doctor is giving this kind of unreasonable, foolish even answer, and so this went on for years and years. And then as an adult, I started to experience a tremendous amount of symptoms: brain fog, fatigue, severe abdominal pain, cramps, where it was really affecting the quality of my life. And once again, I went to the experts, the people who were well known in their field, gastroenterologists, GI doctors, all kinds of doctors. And everyone gave me this more or less the same answer: it's stress. We can put you on medication, or you can quit your job.
Mhm.
And I didn't think either of those were viable
But
options.
those are your only two options that they gave you?
Only two options that they gave me.
Wow.
Yeah. And this was maybe 7 or 8 different doctors. And so, you know, I was very distraught because, how can you live another 60, 70 years with this debilitating pain?
Mhm.
I mean, there were days where I couldn't even walk. And so I started thinking, well,
What
there
age were
must,
you at the time?
I believe I was 25 or 26 when all of
Okay.
these issues started. I mean, the brain fog was already from
Yeah.
childhood, but I think I had just damaged my gut lining, throughout
Mhm.
from childhood to adulthood, that the symptoms had just become so exaggerated. And so I thought, what can I do? And one day I was talking to a friend, and he mentioned, well, what about the food that you're eating? And I said, it can't be the food that I'm eating. I eat a very healthy diet. I'm eating whole grains and lots of milk and fruits and vegetables, and I don't really eat much cookies and cakes.
Yeah.
And so, but then I started thinking, but what if there's something to that? Because that's the only thing that I had not addressed.
Yeah.
And so I started doing my research, and I started to learn, okay, well, food can have an impact on health and it can cause harm. So let me make some big changes. And I, eliminated some stuff. Within 2 weeks, I was feeling better than I had ever felt in my entire life. Just 2 weeks. No medication, no other major changes other than I had, cut out dairy. Turns out I'm lactose
Mhm.
intolerant. None of my doctors thought to.
And nobody found that out?
Nope.
Wow.
And non-celiac gluten sensitivity, can be a thing. And I happen to be one of those people who's
Can you
impacted
explain what
by.
it is?
So gluten is a protein that can impact folks, damaging their gut lining, and then it presents in many different ways. So once the gut lining is damaged, now imagine, you have like little pores that where food particles, bacteria can start to not enter the, your main
Mhm.
blood system and bloodstream. And so it can impact your ability to think clearly, brain fog. You become susceptible to illness more because your immune system is constantly, it creates a low grade inflammation. And
Mhm.
so you're constantly feeling tired and low energy, brain fog. And in my case, my gut had become so damaged that I was actually feeling pain. And when I eliminated certain foods that for me were a trigger, my body was able to heal itself very quickly, which was so amazing for me, that
Yeah.
I said, well, why weren't the doctors able to tell me this? And how did I figure this out? But,
Yeah.
And I continued. I lost a great amount of weight, which I had not been able to lose. The doctors had put me on birth control, like many women are put on birth control to help manage, PMS and
Yeah.
cramping and all of that, not so fun stuff. And so they had said, well, we'll put you on this medication to help manage those symptoms. And as a result, I had gained 40 pounds, which, for my height and my frame is quite a bit. And I was not feeling good. I had my self-esteem had suffered because I had put on all this weight. The brain fog, the pain. And in 2 weeks, I had managed to drop some weight. My energy levels were through the roof, thinking clearly. It was just like this curtain had been lifted. And I thought to myself, how do I bring this? I have to help people the way I was able to help myself.
Yeah.
And being able to see that connection between nutrition and my mental health, and having that background in mental health, I said, you know what? I think this is the next logical step for me. I went to a conference and they gave me guidance. They said, you know what? Go get your credential, become a registered dietitian, and go help people the
Yeah.
way you helped yourself. And so I did.
Yeah.
That led
Okay.
me to here.
Yeah. Can you explain what is gut lining?
So the
At
gut
least in
is,
simple terms.
yeah, and really simple. It's basically your intestine, your large intestine, your small intestine, the internal membrane.
Yeah.
Depending on the foods that you might eat, can have a negative impact. And not only foods, but medication, stress, a whole, virus, bacteria, a whole bunch of things can damage the intestinal lining. And so that's what I mean by gut,
Okay.
gut lining. It's just that membrane that lines the inside
Okay.
of the intestines.
Okay.
And
So
that can be,
membrane inside of the gut that can be damaged by different
yes,
stuff. Okay.
by a number of different things.
Talking in normal human language, like, oh, okay, got it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, I probably should have started with explaining
No,
what
but like
that is.
because it's something that for some people they might know what it is, because like, oh, I understand when you mean gut, but I didn't exactly know what actually is like gut lining. So that's good that you were able to explain it. So okay, because you did it in 2 weeks, that's not a long, speaking of patience and things like that, it's actually not that long time. And especially with things that you have had literally for years that you had to deal with, that doctors didn't really give you any straight answers, or the answer most of the time was like medication or something like that. So you said that you started to either change some foods, take something out. So how did you know, or how did you make that decision on what is it that you actually change, or what is it that you take out, or where did you base that decision on, or where did that decision making process came from?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So my research was showing certain foods can be inflammatory and can cause symptoms like that, I was experiencing. And so I figured, hey, let me eliminate it and see how I feel. And it was a lot of reading, researching and reading nutrition labels, looking at ingredients to make sure that those main triggers were not in the foods that I was still continuing to eat. And as I've become, credentialed and more educated, we know that there are certain food groups that are, common allergens like wheat, soy, dairy, eggs. These are common things that can, it create some kind of negative health issues for some folks, for many folks. And also important to note is our food here in the US, it's, we use a lot of pesticides, and sometimes it's the pesticides that the body is, responding to. And so, and I'm not saying that certainly every food has to be organic, or I'm absolutely not saying
Yeah.
that, but it might be worth looking at, what foods you are eating the most, like leafy greens, or foods that don't have a shell, like a peel or anything
Yeah.
like that. It might be worth it to look and focus on just having those foods, because organic just means it's less pesticides, slightly different pesticides,
Yeah.
but there are pesticides being used nonetheless, right? But I think some issue is that folks will respond or react, their body will react differently to the different types of pesticides being used. In addition to, for example, wheat here in the US is very greatly hybridized. And so, in the 60s, the government started, to hybridize wheat. And so since then, it is no longer what it was prior to the 60s. And people are responding to it in a much different way, because it's no longer what our ancestors ate, right? So in Europe, and I'm not sure in Canada, but I know in Europe, they're not using the same type of hybridized wheat that we use here. And so
Yeah.
when people from the US travel to Europe and they say, well, I was able to eat all this bread and I didn't feel awful, and I didn't gain any weight, and, nothing happened to me. Yeah, because, the quality of the food is very different. And, so it's important to see how much you're consuming of a certain thing and what type of impact that one food might be having. If you eliminate that, we have to eliminate one at a time to see what food it
Yeah.
might actually be that's causing these symptoms. Or, you can take an aggressive approach and eliminate a whole bunch of things and then
Yeah.
reintroduce them one at a time. And this is maybe an unpopular opinion for other dietitians, but my personal stance is, and I will say it here, is that we are dietitians. Our job is to understand many different diets, eating patterns, and understanding what the therapeutic component of each diet or eating style may be.
Mhm.
And that's not to say that, these fad diets are only fad diets because the masses just, it gets promoted on social media or TV, or some article gets published and everybody jumps on the bandwagon, right? But there are genetic components
Yeah.
that may make you responsive to a certain diet. And then there are certain genes that will make you unresponsive. So we really have to get down to the basics of it to understand what will work for you. And certainly we can use a number of different diets to
Yeah.
treat a person's chronic disease or issues that they may experience. For example, histamine. Histamine is a like we have allergies, right? So histamine is produced from allergic
Mhm.
responses to the environment, can be to food, and the body's job is to break it down and eliminate it. But some of us don't have the ability to, because of our genetics, we are not good at breaking down and eliminating it. And or the histamine load is very high, and so we're not breaking it down and
Yeah.
eliminating as fast as the load is being created. And so we have to look at how to reduce that, and really we can do blood tests, or we can do a genetic test and say, all right, well, your body is actually not that great at detoxing these histamines, so how can we support your recovery? And that would be the first thing that we would look at, because histamine can lead to a whole host of other issues. For example, low-grade inflammation. So for someone who wants to lose weight, well, we have to address this histamine issue first, because it's kind of like a cascade effect, right? And so we have to look at foods that will trigger, a histamine response there, that are either high in histamine themselves or that are histamine liberators. So basically you eat it and
Mhm.
it creates a response where the body will create, high histamine. And so we have to address that. Will the person be on a low histamine diet forever? No, it's a very restrictive, right? We have to be very mindful of the time frame and manage the symptoms. As symptoms start to improve, then we can start to incorporate foods back in and look at other therapeutic, like I said, diets, right?
Yeah.
Until we're at a point where the individual is now starting to feel the quality of their life returning. They're not just in survival mode anymore. They're actually starting to thrive. And those improvements can be seen relatively depending on the severity, and I'll say that, depending on the severity of the symptoms, fairly quickly, I would say in a couple of weeks to a couple of months, you start to feel better.
Mhm.
And I've had folks, after a week, they're like, I didn't realize that I was eating so poorly. I'm eating more whole foods now. I'm eating more vegetables, more fruits, and my energy levels have gone up.
Mm.
And
Well, it
so,
makes sense for energy to go up if you change the diet, but at the same time, I think in a way, I know more about like personal development and things like that, and it's really similar concept where when we want some change, we start to look externally. What can I change externally? So in this case, it might be supplements, medication, or stuff like that, instead of looking at the, in a way, like the inner, what's happening inside of you. What is it that you're actually eating? So then when you start to change that, because quite literally, we are what we eat. So there's a reason why we're eating, and that's one of the things that even like people that struggle with binge eating, something like that. I was listening to, I think it was Andrew Huberman podcast, where he was saying that when you struggle with some eating disorders, that can be a big challenge, because it's pretty much like saying, I don't know, an alcoholic that, well, you can't really not drink, but you have to drink like 1 glass a day. And that's where it's a challenge, because if it's something that you're addicted to, it's like I think a really good example was Andy Frisella. He was talking about it. He's a business owner, and he said that it's pretty much like saying somebody who is addicted to cocaine to say that you can sniff only a little a day, like and that's something that I'm not sure if the sniff is the right word. It's the only word that I knew in English, but like you get what I mean. And that's really interesting, even like our relationship with food and how that can affect certain things, because even, let's say, things that you explain on logical level for a lot of people, oh yeah, makes sense. And even now listening, they might be like, I feel actually motivated to go and do this or go and change it, or at least if I don't know where to do it, probably the best way is to find a dietitian or like go to you, and actually get that expert support. But then when you actually have to start to do it, that's where emotions can get in a way. And you're like, but like I can eat it today. Like, or like, I can do it tomorrow. Or you justify not doing it because of that. And it's really interesting how it works, that like relationship with food that you have built. And but that's just like a thought that I had as you were speaking. But one thing that I wanted to ask you, you mentioned main triggers. Can you explain more, what are those triggers, or are there any signs of, oh, this is a trigger, or like how does that trigger actually look like?
so with respect to the food
Yeah.
allergens, yeah. So there are a few that are common allergens, and most people, they're somewhere on the spectrum, where it's very mild, maybe in sensitivity to it, to actual full-on allergic, reaction, where if they eat it, their life may become, at risk, and they have to carry an EpiPen with them or something like that. Um, but I think it becomes more obvious for the folks who have the very clear signs, right? It's all of the folks who have mild to moderate reactions to these main allergens,
Mhm.
or I'll say allergens because sensitivity, on a scale from
Yeah.
sensitivity to allergen, right? So minor to major impact. And so I think it depends, if over time, like for myself, wheat was not doing me any favors. And so, but it took decades for that symptom to manifest in an actual place where it was a point of pain for me. And then I had to start looking, okay, well, but I've been eating well my whole life. I've been following the recommendations that the, the standard American diet that is
Yeah.
recommended to everybody. But that wasn't working for me. That was what was actually harming me. And it was the grains and the dairy and some of the ingredients that may not be, the best for us. And eliminating those things made me open my eyes like, oh, wow, food really has a big impact, And why did it have an impact? Because of my genetics.
Yeah.
My body is, built a certain way, but that's not to say that your DNA is your destiny. It's certainly not. We can, when we do genetic testing, the genetic test that I offer, it looks at, different genes that might become an issue in the future, right? So
Mm.
if we can look at that proactively rather than reactively, I think that is a more appropriate way to manage disease rather than, well, I have this now, let me take XYZ medication. And certainly if you are at that point, absolutely follow your doctor's recommendations,
Yeah.
take the medications. But if we can walk, and some things can be walked back, and some things cannot be walked back. But for those things that we can kind of, improve, for example, diabetes management, we can certainly get blood sugars under
Mhm.
control. And if we know that we're predisposed to it, why not work more aggressively to avoid that?
Mhm.
Rather than just say, oh, I'm predisposed to it. I find a lot of folks have this mentality, well, it's in my genes. There's nothing
Yeah.
I can do. I'm going to get it. And so I might as well just enjoy what I want to enjoy. And okay, yes, enjoy what you want to enjoy. No foods, are off the table. Absolutely enjoy the food because, food provides not just nourishment, but there is definitely, a psychological
Yeah.
component to it, right? And so we have to honor and respect that point of food. But to say that it's a lost cause, that is not the case, right? We can certainly make changes to prevent that from happening while still enjoying the foods that you want to
Yeah.
enjoy. And that's where the behavioral component comes in, setting small reasonable goals where that helps an individual gain confidence in their ability to carry out, this. We have a bigger goal, but
Yeah.
then we break it down into a series of tiny little steps to get to that bigger goal. And along the way, person starts to feel, oh, I'm feeling better. Oh, I can
Mhm.
do this. These are really reasonable things for me to do. And I always look for that feedback from folks that I'm working with, right? Like, what are your thoughts on this? Is this doable for
Mhm.
you? And, they're like, well, it's a really, really tiny goal. This seems like nothing. I'm like, yes, I understand. It seems like almost nothing, but I want you to gain the confidence. I want you to, build a habit, and then we build on this. We have to gain momentum. We can't gain momentum from a stopped place,
Yeah.
right? And certainly life happens, things happen, and you may slow down, but I think that's also the benefit of working with, a dietitian. There is some kind of accountability that can be afforded to you and keep you on track. All right, well, life happened. Cool. Let's just keep going, right?
Yeah.
How do we work on this? How do we prevent you from kind of, maybe if you felt like you went off the tracks, how do we establish a support system where that may not happen again, Or okay, you had it. Did you enjoy it? And sometimes they'll say, yes, I enjoyed it. Okay, no
Yeah.
regrets. No regrets. It's in the rearview mirror, keep on going, right? Understand the consequences if there are. For example, if you know that it's going to raise your blood sugars, then understand it's going to raise your blood
Yeah.
sugars. If you're not going to feel good, some foods, like if you're going to have dairy or wheat and you know that I don't feel so good afterwards, well, you certainly have that choice. Nobody's taking that choice
Yeah.
away from you. But you have to understand that are you willing to deal with the consequences? And sometimes people are like, I'm
Yeah.
okay with this. I will deal with it, you know? Okay, fine. Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
a-okay. But then, you know, we want to keep moving forward. We don't want to get stuck into, you know, addictive behaviors, right? Or start to create, you know, sometimes, and we have to be careful too, so not to create disordered eating,
Yeah.
or if somebody is recovering from eating disorder, you know, there are, and I'm not trained in that, so I'm not going to speak too much on that, but to refer people out when you start to identify those issues arising.
Hmm.
But for the most part, you know, everything is fine, but just
Yeah.
understanding what your limits are and having enough to keep you satisfied and keep you on track to reaching your much bigger goals.
Okay. With the something that you mentioned at the very, very beginning about root and roots versus symptoms. So is the genetic or genetic testing part of that route? And I just want to understand, let's say, how does, because as you speak it makes sense, roots and symptoms, but do you have like, can you give like an example on how they look? And then going further, how does that genetic testing look? What's the process there?
Yeah, so certainly the genetic test will give us a good indication of what, you know, what might be going on. Like, for example, histamine. Most people are, we can assume based on symptoms, but the genetic test will show us that actually your body is not great at detoxing. So we have to provide some support. And that creates a guide for us. The genetic test creates sort of a guide for us, and it eliminates some guesswork, right? Like we still need to do
Hmm.
labs and blood tests to confirm certain things. You know, the genetic test is not an end all be all. It's not going to explain everything to us, but we can also do elimination and look at symptoms as a result of doing elimination. If folks don't want to, you know, continue with certain functional lab tests, you know, because they can be expensive and insurance here in the US doesn't usually cover them,
Hmm.
with the exception of basic, you know, comprehensive labs. And so we can identify then, all right, this is what we need to work on first, see how you feel. If you see improvements, okay, then we need to continue. And there's a lot of asking questions like, what are your
Hmm.
symptoms? Are these indicative of what your genes are saying? You know, it could be that you have the gene, but you're not really expressing it, right? Or like, for example, if we're predisposed to diabetes, okay, we're predisposed, we have a genetic marker for it, but you may not be, you know, you're not going to be like if you're in your 40s, not every
Yeah.
40-year-old is going to have
So in a way,
diabetes.
like it doesn't mean that you actually will have it.
Correct.
Yeah.
But it gives us a clear idea of how to kind of create a plan to avoid the
Hmm.
expression of certain things, or if something is being expressed, how do we, you know, how do we manage it from a root cause, real true root cause, you know, rather than symptom management, which is what Western medicine
Hmm.
is primarily doing, right? Um, and the test itself is very simple. You know, the kit gets mailed out to the person, they collect a saliva sample and they ship it into the lab. Takes about, you know, 3 to 4 weeks for it to get
Hmm.
processed. And you get a very in-depth 31-page report with recommendations on, you know, dietary changes. There's also a really nice portion in it which looks at what exercise would benefit you based on your
Hmm.
genetic makeup.
That's
And
interesting.
so injury, you know, how quickly you recover from injury, how you need to prevent injury. So if you're like for me, for example, weight training is recommended for me just because of the way my genetics are. And I see results very quickly when I do weight training, but I'm also injury prone.
Hmm.
And so I have to take the extra time to warm up properly, to make sure, you know, I'm hydrated. I'm, you know, I'm eating enough protein and so forth, so that I don't injure myself when I do go weight train, right? And for some folks, they might be better at cardio. And so, the test really shows all of these things, and it's nice. So you don't have to wonder anymore, like, those
Yeah.
endless memberships to the gym, like I know I probably spent a small fortune on different
Yeah.
number of different gyms, and I never really liked any of them because it wasn't for me. I went into a weight training program, and I loved it instantly
Yeah.
because it was appropriate for my genes, and I saw results pretty quickly. And whereas other people who were coming to the gym, and everybody should do it. Look, everybody should do
Yeah.
all kinds of exercise. I'm not saying, eliminate anything.
Yeah.
Cardio is important, stretching is important, but you get a clearer idea of where you might see the most improvements, you know, running versus weights versus, yoga versus XYZ.
Yeah. That's interesting. So wait, even as you were speaking, I'm thinking about let's say this example with gym. Is there a way that somebody who, let's say, hasn't done that test, that they can kind of sense or know what is it that is better for them, mainly based on that taking their actions, or it can be in a way like misleading going that route?
Well, I mean, I think do what you enjoy, right? Like that's a pretty good indicator, doing what you enjoy, because activity is very important to a healthy heart, healthy brain, longevity, all the good stuff. So I think that's the main thing.
Yeah.
If you find something that you enjoy, do it consistently. If you're looking for results, then we have to kind of see, and I think most people will get results from any type of
Yeah.
activity. But going back to the fastest, right? The fastest,
Hmm.
if you're looking for the most effective shortest route, then we should see, what is your body built for?
Yeah.
How can we maximize what you're designed to do, right? Like all of our answers are within ourselves, not
Yeah.
to sound cliche, but really quite literally. What's best for us is within ourselves. And so
Yeah.
some folks are good, they're very intuitive and they can figure out, I like doing this. My body responds really well to this, whether it's through exercise, whether it's through meditation, whether it's through, the foods, and some folks have kind of lost touch with their internal selves. And so, that can result in overeating, not being active, just a number of things it can present because they've lost that connection within themselves.
Yeah.
And so when we look at food, we kind of talk about intuitively eating, listening to the cues, listening to the symptoms that you're experiencing. Are certain foods making you feel worse? This is without any testing. It's very trial and error.
Yeah.
The testing provides you a path. There will still be some trial and error with that, but it gives you a clearer path as to what we need to look at first, as opposed to not having any idea at all.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say they have you get, I don't know, let's say you do the testing, or not you do the testing, but like how does the process look like? Like how do you get that information, and even that specific information, even down to, oh, this is the kind of exercise you actually could be better to do, or like could be better for you, or like you said yourself that you actually have to warm up because you can get some injuries, things like that. So how does that information look like? How do you get it out of literally like saliva?
Yeah, so our cells, the DNA is in every cell of our
Yeah.
being, and so the folks who do the fancy stuff at the genetics lab, they do what they do, and then they've actually compiled all of this information into a very user-friendly report, right? So we take some time to go over the results, create a plan, and hopefully over a certain amount of time, we reach the goals that the individual wanted. But they have this report for the rest of their lives, the recommendation, because your genes are your genes. They're not going to
Yeah.
change. And so even after we, stop working together over XYZ amount of time, you still have this blueprint to yourself. Okay, and then now you're better aware of what the symptoms are. You can look
Yeah.
at this 31-page report. It's, laid out very nicely where an individual can read it
Mhm.
and apply it, continue to apply it themselves.
Yeah.
So, I think that was the question, right? Like, how do we
Yeah.
interpret this information? How easy is it for me or for the person who's ordering the test to interpret it
Yeah.
and apply it? Very easy. The creator of the test is actually also a dietitian, and has been working on this test for over a decade. And the test says, I believe it's 149 different clinically significant
Mhm.
markers that they look at, as opposed to some other genetic tests that may not be, some of them may overlap, but they're certainly not looking at 149 clinical markers, right?
Yeah.
So we can see, like, for example, what exercise would be best for you. What is your injury? How prone are you to injury? How many calories do you burn while sitting? Is exercise more important for you, or is diet more important for you? And while both are important for
Yeah.
everybody, there is a balance. Some people will benefit more from the physical activity, and some people will do better with focusing more on the nutrition, in a sustainable way. And that's what I want to point out, that
Yeah.
the results that I'm looking to get are sustainable, because we can eliminate foods, we can cut calories, we can cut carbs. Great, that will get you the results. But is it sustainable long term? Like a year, 5 years, 10
Yeah.
years from now, where will you be? And
Yeah.
so if it's based on your individual, truly individualized report, I feel that would encourage people to say, hey, you know what? This is really for me. This is catered for me.
Yeah.
It's not like a standardized, public health kind of recommendation.
Yeah.
It's individual, and I should be able to carry this out. And look, again, all this ties in together, right? The behavioral component again. Things will happen, our coping, it's important how we cope with things. And so including all of that, looking at the genetics, looking at the behavioral aspect, what are the individual's coping mechanisms like? And then also referring out to other
Yeah.
support providers, therapists. Maybe a person needs a dietitian who's specialized in eating disorders, because all of us are not trained in that. We have our
Yeah.
specializations. And so how do we help this person get the results and more or less be consistent throughout the rest of their
Yeah.
life, right? Like, we don't just want this to be a short term 3 month or a couple of months thing, and then the weight is coming back and symptoms are returning, and person is like, I spent all this time and all this money, and
It
well,
didn't work.
exactly.
It doesn't work. I didn't get result that I do work for like few
Yeah.
months and it stays forever. Yeah.
And, I think it's more of a mindset shift, and we don't want to think about this in terms of diet, right? We want to
Yeah.
look at this in terms of a lifestyle change.
Yeah.
How can we make these important changes, looking at sleep, looking at stress, looking at how you cope with stress, mental health, physical activity? All of these are important.
Yeah.
We can't neglect any part of this, because this is, sleep. I just was reading a study where they showed people who got less than 5 hours of sleep, it had negative impact on metabolic processes. So weight loss, they were at increased risk for developing chronic disease, even for, one night. But if people were consistently getting less than 5 hours of sleep,
Oh,
which is a
wait, that was
lot of
just one night?
uh, one night can have an impact, and there's
Okay.
no catching up. There's no such thing as making, I'll sleep later on the weekend and I'll
Yeah.
catch up. that's not the case, unfortunately. I think many of us have grown up with this idea that, well, I've had a busy week, I'll sleep more on the
Yeah.
weekend. In fact, the study actually showed that folks who slept longer on the weekends to make up didn't fare as well who just continued to sleep 5 hours throughout
Mm.
the 7 days. So, sleep is very important, and sleep hygiene is something that, I like to talk about with folks too. Are you looking, do you have the TV on when you're sleeping? Are you looking at your phone?
Yeah.
How quiet is it? All of that is important. And
Yeah.
so, yeah,
But actually,
sustainability.
yeah. But that actually, like as you're speaking, I was thinking that there's so many things that we actually don't know about ourselves and our bodies, genetics, that a lot of times, even if we knew them, we could quickly resolve them, or at least, which is something that I think a lot of times helps, is at least know where it's coming from. That, oh, this is why this and that is happening. And now I actually know what is it that I can do to change it. Because if you get this experience where, let's say, you experience something that you don't like, or I don't know, get some kind of disease or something like that, and now you get so confused that why me, or like what do I do, or even like in your case, you like technically there wasn't really given a real solution to you that would make sense. At least if I was asked like given those two options, I probably would be thinking that as well, like that there has to be another way. um which actually shows a lot about your mindset, that you didn't have this like closed mindset that, okay, I just have to choose this or that, but you actually knew that there must be another way. But yeah, there's so much that we actually don't know about ourselves that uh sometimes it might actually be scary to know, because then, as you said, like there are certain genes that you might have that they might not be active necessarily, but now you know that, oh, I have it, or like
Absolutely.
that can affect as well, and that might even cause fear for a lot of people, similar to that like dark room like
Yeah,
example, that they might
absolutely.
rather not know it than know it.
Yeah, and a perfect example of that is, the Alzheimer's gene, right? So that is one clinical marker that gets tested for. And now the individual has the option to not know, but as a provider, we see, if it's there or not. And we can then gently, without informing them, gently guide them to a place where we can potentially,
Yeah.
prevent that from happening without the individual knowing, right?
Yeah.
And there are other, like heart disease, diabetes, these are kind of
Yeah.
more, you can survive. I mean, you can still have a good quality of life if you make the necessary changes. But Alzheimer's is a very scary, it's a very scary thing. And to know that you're a carrier for that gene certainly could have a serious negative
Yeah.
ramifications for an individual. So I certainly understand if a person would not want to know,
Yeah.
especially if they've had family members who have been diagnosed, right?
Yeah.
And so, but if you had a provider who knew, who could make recommendations rather than you kind of, it's a 50-50 chance, either I
Yeah.
have it or I don't have it. If a provider knew and could kind of gently guide you to a lifestyle that may possibly prevent that, I would rather that than
Yeah.
just nobody knowing ever until symptoms started
Yeah.
to become apparent, right? Um, I've actually had some folks on even much smaller things say that to me, if even just for being injury prone, because I've spoken at a couple of gyms and things like
Mhm.
that. Some folks were like, well, I don't want to know if I'm injury prone,
Yeah.
but why not? You if you need to take an extra 10-15 minutes to warm up properly, because you're injury prone, like you're gonna get injured. That is a very, if you're in a gym where you're lifting weights and that's already putting you, you're already at risk of
Yeah.
injury, and then your genetics are kind of already not in your favor in that respect, wouldn't you rather know how to prevent that rather than just get injured?
Yeah.
And that was a conversation that I had to have with a couple of folks, like, explain your logic to me. And they're like, but I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to know. I'm like, I would be afraid not to know, because if I'm injury prone, I will get hurt. I would rather
Yeah.
take the preventive steps and then continue my active lifestyle, because if you get hurt, then
Yeah.
depending on the severity of the injury, you're going to be out of the gym for a couple of weeks, or
Yeah.
work, or whatever other, life events will be going on. You can't participate.
Yeah. Like
And
one thing that might be, I'm thinking that might be that mindset, or the reason for it is that if you now know those things, you kind of know your vulnerabilities. And a lot of times we don't really want to know them or admit that we have them. So we rather not know. So now you can kind of get this illusion that I can't really get those injuries, or I'm not like prone injury, or like injury prone, or what's the right way to say it.
yeah,
But like that might be one way, because we, especially nowadays, when you see everything perfect everywhere you look, and that might be that actually rather avoid knowing what is it that could potentially be bad, or because like logically it makes sense. If I know those things, I actually know what can I do to prevent that. But I think that knowing those things can put somebody in a mindset that I'm now in a weak position, and I don't want to be in a weak position. That might be one thing, potentially.
yeah. I mean, that makes absolute sense, and that would go in that room.
Yeah.
Turn the light off. It's in there. Certainly, it would force you to look at your humanness,
Yeah.
your mortality in a way, right? Like, I
Yeah.
can get hurt, I can get sick, I can potentially, not have a quality of life that I want. And for certain things, I absolutely agree. Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, these are very heavy things to consider, and probably I personally also may not want to know. I happen to know for
Yeah.
myself, but um because I got, I'm a provider and I get the results,
Yeah.
so I happen to see it. But you make the necessary changes.
Yeah.
And if you can be proactive rather than reactive, that's just my stance on it. Why not do a little something to make it? Doesn't have to be big, major
Yeah.
steps, right? It's just the small things, small daily actions give you big long-term results.
Yeah.
And addressing the behavior around that, what was going on, what are your coping mechanisms, what made you do it. And some folks feel, a tremendous amount of guilt when they
Yeah.
kind of step out of those parameters, like, oh, I had a piece of cake, for example. I had a patient, she was very upset. She had a piece of cake and her blood sugars went very high.
Mm-hmm.
And she was crying, and I said, why are you crying? Like, tell me, talk to me. And she said, I feel like I failed because I gave in. I had the cake. I said, all right, well, let's put this in perspective, right? You had one piece of cake. You're doing incredibly well. She lost all this weight. Her A1C improved tremendously. She initially had come in with a walker. She was off the walker, ambulating, independently. And I'm like, did you forget all your success?
Yeah.
Like, you had one piece of cake. Did you enjoy it? My question is this: did you enjoy it? And she's like, well, yes, I did. I'm like, okay, then that's the most important thing, right?
Yeah.
It's over, done. Your blood sugars are good now. You recovered. Life went
Yeah.
on, right? And so, approaching things with a certain amount of grace and forgiveness. Like, hey, I'm making a decision. And this is also something I talk about with folks is make a decision. You have control over your decision. The environment doesn't have control over you. You have control over, especially over the food that you're eating, right? So go in with that mindset that I am making this decision and I'm happy with this decision, and the outcome is what it is, right?
Yeah.
And that has been such a game changer for folks. And they're like, oh, all right. Yeah, I didn't lose control of the situation. I think it's that feeling loss of control, right?
Yeah.
And so giving people that control back, I'm like, well, you have control. Make the choice.
Yeah.
If you want to have it, have it. There's
Yeah.
no rule anywhere that says, all carbs are bad, or, all cakes are bad, and all these enjoyable things are bad. No, they serve a purpose. They serve enjoyment. They're part of socializing. They're part of celebrations, holidays, traditions. And, we have to honor that. Different
Yeah.
cultures use different foods for different occasions. Honor that, respect it. And so, not the end of the world, right?
Yeah. And even
And
like that mindset with having, because that's something that I have seen. Even like a few episodes back, I was talking to Dr. Rob Bell. He's a sports psychologist, about how he said, I think he said about, like, I don't remember how he called. I think it was like one mistake, or let's say you set this goal and now you do let's say with the cake example, you set the goal not to eat sweets, something like that, and you eat the cake. And a lot of times for a lot of people, that one piece of cake is enough now to quit. I failed. And I think that's where a lot of times we have this perception that for us to get this certain result, the process has to be perfect, or we can't really get off the path that we're on. But what I have learned is the biggest thing actually is not necessarily you getting off, or let's say having a piece of cake, but how soon you get back on the path and you just keep going. And with that, I think comes pretty much what you said, like being able to enjoy it and also forgive yourself for that. Don't beat yourself up. And remember that nobody's perfect, except that I'm not perfect. I will make mistakes, and even go into this journey with expectation that it will not be perfect. I will make mistakes. It's guaranteed. But also one thing that I wanted to mention, when we were talking about these results, or maybe results that we don't want to know, or things like that, I wrote down that fear can also be like a motivator. That, let's say you're now afraid of getting this disease, in a way you can actually leverage it, where now you use that fear to actually go and take the steps necessary to put yourself in a position where you can avoid this happening. So sometimes fear can be a good thing if you use it right, where, oh my gosh, I know that I have this gene or something like that, so now I'm afraid of getting it or activating it, from what I understood.
Yeah.
So now I'm more motivated to actually take those steps, because that fear can play that role of, this is my motivator for actually taking those steps. So there's like several things how I think we all can play around with certain, even like emotions, that you might have fear from seeing results, but then you actually can use that fear when you get those results, about results that you don't want, because that might be another thing, that you see results and you're disappointed. Oh shoot, I have this or that. I actually now have to deal with that. Before, when I didn't know that, I didn't have to deal with it.
Yeah.
But then if you're afraid of that, let's say getting that disease or something like that, you can now actually use that fear as motivation to take action on those things that you need to take action on.
Yeah. And I mean, at the very least, even if you don't want to take action, and it's just, you just know,
Yeah.
if at some point you wanted to make those changes, you would know what steps to take.
Yeah.
So it's not an end all be all. It's not that,
Yeah.
if I know, great. If I don't know, great. There's certainly pros and cons
Yeah.
to be argued for each side, right? And it just depends on what your mindset is. For me, personally, I would rather know
Yeah.
if I can take those steps now to mitigate, you know, anything in the future. Yeah, why not? I don't really want to be an elderly person suffering
Yeah.
from XYZ things. If I can kind of prepare for that now,
Yeah.
I would like to have a quality of life. And for me personally, I know a lot of people are looking for longevity, and that's great. For me personally, I just want quality of life.
Yeah.
Whatever the time is, I want it to be healthy with,
Yeah.
intact faculties, ability to be independent. And that's why I made this choice to take the test, and
Yeah.
also, you know, when I saw the benefit of it, I said, I gotta, this is really the root cause of, I can,
Yeah.
whoever decides to do it will really learn about themselves,
Yeah. And
really on
that's I think
real,
a big piece to really learn about yourself.
how your brain works, even it, and some providers, some doctors are even using genetic testing to determine what medications work better for patients.
Yeah.
Um, you know, so there's, that's to be considered too. Genetics is being used in a number of different ways, to detect breast cancer, any kind of cancer, any type of genetic
Yeah.
disease, right? So why not for the quality of life?
Yeah.
Why does it have to be only associated with looking for bad things?
Yeah.
There are a lot of good things there too that you will find. And that's just my perspective on it.
Oh yeah.
Now I know I'm injury prone. Great. I know that I need to warm up a little bit
Yeah.
more. Maybe I won't sprain my ankle or, break a wrist or whatever it is if I just take care of myself.
Yeah.
If I know that, I'm, predisposed to diabetes, okay,
Yeah.
well, now I know. I need to
Yeah.
exercise more. I need to build muscle, because building muscle mass also helps regulate, glucose sensitivity, right? Insulin resistant and insulin sensitivity is also very closely related to exercise.
Yeah.
And so why not? I can
Yeah.
create a better plan for myself rather than just letting things happen to me, you know, and surely the environment, has an impact on
Yeah.
how genes are expressed, right? So we really can't ignore that, but we can eliminate or mitigate as much of that as we possibly can, right? Um, Using better products, better personal hygiene products,
Yeah.
better food, better sleep environment. Better water, do we need to filter our water? What do we need to do?
Yeah.
There are some things that are within our control. And so why not exercise that control rather than feeling like we are victims of the world that we live in?
Yeah. I was about to say this because that was one of the thoughts that came in my mind, is that you get this like sense of control that you actually know. Like, and that knowing by itself gives at least some sense of control that and it's really interesting how that knowing works. That's why initially I went to that fear, because that's something that I have seen, is that sometimes we are afraid to see or to know things like that. But at the same time, once we know them, that's where in a way you can even be at peace, because you know, even if you
Yeah.
don't like things that you see or whatever, but like at least you know, and that can give this maybe calmness that at least you know. But going on, uh talking about those behavioral steps that that can be taken. So once you get results, then I assume the process is that you assess the person that you're working with certain behavioral aspects of what they can do, actions they can take. So how does that look like?
There are some things that can be addressed on a more simpler level. But I've also recently spoken with a board certified behavior analyst. So I'm looking to bring an expert that, this is their wheelhouse, and they can specifically address, some barriers that individuals might have trouble even identifying, things that they can identify clearly. All right, yes, let's tackle it. Let's work on ways to bring those barriers down. But sometimes folks aren't really fully cognizant or aware what might be an internal, struggle or battle. They may say, I'm ready for the change, but then after a couple of sessions, you start to find that they maybe weren't entirely ready. And so who can I bring in now to help, who's specifically trained to address these barriers or challenges and create a plan to overcome it, break it down actually altogether and get past it so we can reach those long-term goals. Because, we're creatures of habit. We are.
Oh,
we
yeah,
tend
big
to
time.
creatures of habit. We're, comfort, we like all of these things. The familiarity of stuff is just, it's just in our nature, right? In our DNA, so to speak. So that requires some active work, right? Some retrospect, some insight, and then also allowing others to help you, going to the appropriate folks to get that help and allowing them to guide you so that you can get your results that you're looking for. And I think all of us in the health field, really just want the best outcomes for the people that we're working with. I mean, what better feeling, a bit of maybe selfishness there too. Like you feel good when you help somebody reach their health goal, and, they come in, they're happy, their energy levels are up. They've, made massive strides, whether it's improving their labs or weight loss, or, just feeling healthier. That is so satisfying and so fulfilling. And so if we can work collectively to help that individual, I think, why not? And if a board certified behavior analyst is one of those folks to help me do it, and I think that's also fairly new. That's something that I'm introducing into my service. Not everybody is doing this. I know that when I had spoken to this behavior analyst, he was very surprised. He's like, well, this is very new. Everybody talks about it, but nobody actually ever does it. I said, well, I worked in the mental health for so long. I see the importance. I see the necessity. I can do everything that on my end and motivate them and do all the, questioning and everything that we need to do. But if the individual is hitting a wall, a barrier, well, then I need to bring in an expert who can help them get through that, break it down and move past it. I can't be everything for everybody. We all can't be everything for everybody. We have to know what is within our scope and allow people to come in and work collaboratively. I think that's the most important thing. So, I'm looking forward to offering this service. I think people will be satisfied, once they're making those changes, because behavior is the biggest obstacle, right? We're all just, so, like I said, creatures of comfort. And so change is, it's uncomfortable.
I usually say that change is something that we want, but we actually don't want.
Yes.
We want it, but we actually don't want it.
We want it, but we don't necessarily want to work for it.
Like we want the result of the change, but we don't want to have the actual change or like the process of the change. Because that's where we have to do something that we might not want to, or we're not used to doing. We have to now go out of our like old ways or start to build new habits. who wants to build new habits? I like my old ones, or it's like a lot of resistance to doing that. So like even what you're talking about, the change or behavior, that's something that I find really interesting. I definitely don't have the I would say like scientific understanding behind it, but that's something that I have analyzed a lot even in myself, and just seeing how sometimes it's such a challenge to start to make or do certain changes. And then once I learned to do that, even like recently I was thinking about how I would like to understand it better. So now that you even mentioned this, I'm like, okay, I have to support some people to connect to in this field as well. Because change is something that I feel that most of us will have to go through at some point, whether we want it or not, whether we do it voluntarily or not, but we will have to go through a change at some point. But that ability, especially I think in today's world, if you're able to change and adapt, it's literally like your superpower because everything is changing all the time. And if you stay in your old ways, things will just, at some point, they might even start to fall apart. And like, good example is businesses. Like, even 10, 20 years ago, nobody was doing anything digital. Now everything is digital. People literally judge your service or how good your business is based on your like Instagram or website or something like that. So that's where if you're not able to adapt and change, in a way you lose big time because now you don't seem as credible because online that's how people judge now, or that's how they make those decisions a lot of times. Not everybody or all the times, but that's something where now we are going to in a way. So that ability to change, adapt, and I don't say do it easily because I don't think it's easy to change, no matter what kind of change we're talking about. But one thing that I have learned about change is that starting with small change, that's where, as you said, with when it comes to sustaining it, that's what really helps. Small steps that you can sustain, and you don't have that big of a resistance towards taking those steps. Um,
Absolutely. And I like to I've recently been thinking about it in these terms, wouldn't you want to reach your genetic potential? That's a
mm,
question that I've been thinking about and reflecting on.
that's
How
interesting.
much do I want to reach my genetic potential? I want to know what I'm capable of doing.
Yeah.
And how many people are, I would like to pose that question to your listeners, what is your genetic potential? What are you
Yeah.
really capable of doing? How
Yeah.
strong could you get? How far could you go in life? At any age, there's no
Yeah.
limit, there's really no limit. Um, sometimes I have older patients come in and they're like, I'm 65. I'm not going to be doing any weight training now. And I'm like, why not? Why not? Is there a rule that says that once you turn 65, you cannot
Yeah.
do it? It's different if you don't want to do it, but
Yeah.
you can't do it because of your age. That's not a thing.
Yeah.
So let's speak more frankly. You don't want to do it.
Yeah. And it's interesting how we communicate things as well. Is that we have this idea that, let's say this was like perfect example. Oh, I'm like 65, I can't do it anymore. Well, if you can't, like usually one thing that I like to do or say to others as well is that usually when somebody says, "Oh, I can't do that," I'm like, okay, um, go and at least attempt to do it. And most of the times, these are things that actually we can do it. So now, if you go and do it, and I even communicate in a way that prove yourself wrong. So you go do that thing, you actually show yourself that you can do it, and now you start to question, especially when it comes to limiting beliefs. What else is it that I might think I'm thinking that I might be wrong about? So now you start to go and play this game that, okay, I think that I can't do this. but what can I do to actually show myself or prove myself that I can do it? Or what are the steps that I can take to show myself that I can do it? I don't know, let's say in this lady's situation, okay, go grab some dumbbells, try to lift them. Can you lift them? Okay, you can do
Yeah.
weight training,
And
you know?
yeah, and start with 5 pounds. Nobody's
Yeah,
telling you to go lift, the 25-pound weight.
exactly. Yeah,
Just start where you can. Everybody starts small. Everybody, even the
yeah,
professional athletes started with, the very
yeah.
basics. And sometimes folks are like, oh, well, yes, I suppose that's true. Like, let's
Yeah,
speak honestly here. If you
yeah.
don't want, can't and won't are two different things,
Mm,
and if you say you cannot, then you can't.
yeah,
But if you say I'll try, then you can succeed. You just have to try. You just don't
yeah,
know if you can succeed yet.
yeah.
So, it's saying, you've already defeated if you say I can't. You didn't even try and you defeated yourself.
Mm,
So, to get people out of that, negative self-talk,
yeah,
like you said, the limiting beliefs. And we all do it in different
yeah,
ways. Some of us, they see the gym, strength training, anything as intimidating. And I understand, especially for women, it can be intimidating because typically it's a male dominated environment,
yeah.
especially the weight area, right? And so I understand, but there are ways to work around that, right?
Yeah,
You find a time that it's not as, what are the peak times?
yeah,
What works for you? Maybe you go with a friend, build your confidence. Maybe there's a all women's gym, whatever
yeah,
it is, figure it out. There's always a solution. There's a solution to everything. You just have to
yeah,
be looking for it.
yeah,
Even when doctors or anybody gives you nope, these are the two, this or this. No, there's always some third alternative,
yeah,
always. So just if you
yeah,
feel like there is a way, there is a way.
yeah. And you're a good example to that. Your story.
I refuse to accept what they were saying to me.
But like that's in a way what you needed to actually get on this journey, that okay, I refuse to accept these two options, so because these are my only two options, I might as well go and look for different option or better option myself, because there has to be one.
And it's so unique to every individual person, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, how can these doctors say that there's just two solutions? Everybody has
Yeah.
only two solutions.
And you had many doctors say that as well.
I think, that's just Western medicine is just like that. They're
Mm.
very symptom management. There's no root cause. They don't they're not really trained in looking for the actual problem,
Mhm.
underlying problem. Then there are other issues, right? There's a time constraint where there's a shortage of providers, especially after the pandemic. They are set on 15-minute, they have 15 minutes
Mm.
per patient, to get them in, get them out. Or maybe 30 minutes at the most maximum if you're lucky. What are you going to cover in that much time? So there's,
Yeah.
you kind of have to, for acute care, it's great. I have a cold, I have
Yeah.
broken bone. Okay, I need surgery. Yes, absolutely. They serve that purpose very, very well. But for these chronic things, you kind of have to think outside of the box a little bit and look to those functional medicine providers, functional nutrition, that are going to take the time, sit with you, talk about symptoms, do the labs, and
Yeah.
continue to manage and monitor symptom improvement. But I think that is an emerging field. I think within the past couple of years it's become taken on, it developed more of a presence.
Mhm.
But we certainly have a long way to go still. But I'm happy to see that we've made progress,
Yeah.
in a short amount of time. And now with the emergence of genetics testing, and not every test is going to offer you good results,
Yeah.
clinically relevant results. So it's important to ask the person, because there's a lot of folks out there offering a ton of tests.
Yeah.
You have to know what to ask, how clinically relevant are these results?
Yeah.
What kind of impact will these results have on my quality of my life, my longevity? And it's okay to question your providers, and it's okay to get a second and a third opinion. I think most people, they just take what their doctor says to them. The savvier people, the more inquisitive people will keep looking. But I think most people, because of a, time constraint or just not knowing, we just accept what our doctors say.
Yeah.
And this is another good example. Initially, when the pandemic had started, I believe I had gotten COVID when nobody knew it was COVID, and, difficulty breathing. So I went to the urgent care, and the doctor told me I had asthma. And I said, I don't have asthma. I've never had asthma. And he's like, well, no, you have asthma. And I said, no, I don't have asthma. And he wouldn't listen to me. He just disregarded what I was saying, completely ignored it. So one, because of, being a female, and also two, maybe being a person of color. So those are also things to
Mhm.
consider when in the help, seeing doctors. And he was just kept dismissing me. I'm like, I know I don't have asthma. I've never been diagnosed. And he's like, well, I'm going to give you a nebulizer treatment, and insisted that I had one, and I had it, and it didn't help. And the next 2 days, I continued to get more sick. I ended up calling my primary care office because it was the weekend.
Mhm.
And so my doctor's office was closed. I made an appointment for the weekdays. I went in, and I told her what happened at the urgent care, and she's like, you don't have asthma. Why was he insisting on that? I'm like, I don't know, but I can't breathe. And this has nothing to do with, I know my lungs are being
Mhm.
affected, but this is not asthma. And she's like, no, your lungs sound really bad,
Yeah.
actually. So I'm going to take a very aggressive approach and put you on a number of medications. And I need you to come back every couple of days so we can see that this doesn't turn into pneumonia. You know, Luckily my primary care provider was savvy enough. And I had gone through a number of doctors before I settled on her. And I liked her approach, but again, that was also, I had to go through a lot of providers. Had I just stayed with the urgent care doctor, I may have ended up with pneumonia in the hospital. And
Yeah.
so, it's okay to challenge doctors, right? It's okay to ask questions if you are not feeling well, and you continue to feel worse. So that's one important thing, I want to stress to folks. It's
Yeah.
okay to go for a second and even a third opinion.
Yeah. And it might actually be even sometimes necessary, because that's, I think, how we even form our opinions. Maybe not only when it comes to doctors and things like that, but in life. That if
Yes.
we just gather information from one source, we can't really build good opinion because it's coming from one source. But now if we research, look at different kinds of sources, we can come to our own conclusions, and that's where we actually get this opinion. And I think that's true with pretty much like everything, because a lot of times we hear one thing and now we are so attached to it that this is the truth, and we don't really challenge it, or nobody around us challenges it. Or let's say in your situation, nobody challenges doctors or whatever it is that they say, or whatever the conclusions they come to, because believe it or not, they also are people. They also make mistakes, and sometimes it's good to have somebody to actually challenge them, because we all make errors, and it's good to double check. Or sometimes, and I think that might be a challenge with some doctors, is that because there's this trait, I think, that doctors have because of all the training that they have gone through, that they might think that they know it all. So now if you challenge them, might actually trigger their ego or make them feel like they, or like they might perceive it that you're communicating that they don't know what they're doing or something like that. Because that's something that I feel that they are really attached to that I'm a doctor, because they have gone through so much training, which I can understand. I have all the respect for doctors because that's a hard profession. You have to learn so much. But at the same time, we're all human, so it might be a case that a lot of times, not a lot of times, but there are cases when doctors can make mistakes. So it's good to have somebody to challenge them. Maybe not every patient necessarily, but
Yes,
let's
not
say,
everybody.
but if you know that, let's say you don't have this condition, then it makes sense for you to speak up and actually explain it, that I know I don't have it. I have never had it. So
I think it's the satisfaction, right? Like if you feel like you've gotten a satisfactory answer,
yeah,
then okay, you feel satisfied.
yeah,
But in my case, I was not satisfied.
yeah.
And the
And it
option,
also didn't make sense for you.
it didn't,
Yeah,
um, oh, stress can be caused, inflammation can be caused by anything, certainly. But my stress had nothing had changed in my life
yeah,
except pain had just continued to get worse over time. And I think that was the problem. They weren't listening, or they weren't aware,
yeah,
because they're not, especially at that time, we're talking about maybe 20 years ago, where doctors, this has become more research and more studies have been done. And, even in a couple of years, you have so much research come out.
yeah,
So between then and now, I mean, quite possibly, but on the flip side, I was able to heal myself even then,
yeah,
so the answers were there then too.
yeah,
um but I think in any profession, you have folks that just don't want to be challenged, right? Like,
yeah,
I think for all of us, we need to continue to learn and see what the new research is, how can we better serve our patients, our clients, and to become locked into one,
yeah,
put the blinders on, and, well, this is how I treat my folks, and this is how I'm going to continue, and nobody else can be right. I think is very detrimental to the folks that we're trying to help, because maybe the way that you're trying to treat the patient is not the right way
yeah,
for them.
yeah,
And it's trying to fit a circle into a square, or a square into a circle, right? It's just not gonna work.
yeah,
So we have to all be kind of able to draw from different areas and say, all right, look, this may not be my field, let me send you to another provider who can do it. Or you need a different approach, because everybody is specialized, right? Like, no one doctor does everything. You're always getting referred
yeah,
to as a specialized doctor. Same thing with dietitians. We're all specialized in different areas. I think it just becomes problematic when you encounter a provider who's very dogmatic in their treatment methodologies,
yeah,
right? Functional nutrition, functional medicine is kind of looked as maybe like woo, like
yeah,
non-evidence based, but the research is there. Folks just don't want to look at the existing research, like, just for example, leaky gut or intestinal permeability is a real condition. It's a real problem. I had a supervisor who was a clinical director at a hospital tell me that it was fake news. As I sat on the NIH's website looking at an article on intestinal permeability, and she said, fake news, there's no such thing. And I'm like, wow, you're the clinical director overseeing all of these dietitians, and what a disservice to all of your patients that you are saying this is fake news.
yeah,
When we're sitting here looking at the NIH's website, looking at the article. And then if you go on PubMed, there's like over 5,000. I think there's between 5 and 8,000 research articles on the subject matter. If there's so many, this is not like 5 or 10 or 20 articles,
Yeah.
Research papers. This is over 5,000. So that's pretty significant, right?
Yeah.
And to say that all of these researchers, all of these scientists, all of the money that went into researching this, and all the patients, all the subjects that participated, all of it is null and void, like it's not real. I think it's a very bold statement to make from a provider, especially at such a, high position. I think that folks' egos get in the way.
Yeah.
And, like you said, I know what I know and nobody else can be right. And that creates problem for the patient who's looking for some kind of solution.
Yeah.
So we just have to keep an open mind. And like I said, unpopular opinion, every diet has a therapeutic component.
Yeah.
And we just have to know how to apply those to get the results for our patients.
Yeah.
Whether it be, through genetic testing, different labs, different diets, trial and error. But that's what we went to school for,
Yeah.
is to help our patients. All of us who went into the healthcare field are doing it to improve lives. So, if you have a better solution, why not explore that?
Yeah.
Even if it is a little unorthodox in your opinion, right? Like there are things that will be always unorthodox,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean it won't work. What if it works for that one person?
Yeah.
It may be
Exactly.
anecdotal, but for that person, it changed their life.
Yeah.
So I think, from my perspective, my personal philosophy is I think we owe it to ourselves and to our patients to explore all treatment options, all treatment possibilities. We're as unique as our DNA. What works for one may not necessarily work for the next.
Yeah.
So we have to keep investigating and looking for those sustainable solutions.
Yeah. We covered so many things.
We did.
Maybe as we slowly get into closing off, one thing that I wanted to ask you, and I just keep forgetting it. Can you explain the difference between dietitian and nutritionist?
Yeah, that's a great question. So dietitian is a person who has they have a bachelor's degree, 4-year degree. They've gone through a rigorous internship, usually working in a number of different rotations, working with preceptors, doing 1,200 clinical hours. And then we sit for a board exam. Some states require licensure, some don't, but we all have to take a RD credentialing exam. We are trained specifically in medical nutrition therapy. So we understand all the different disease processes, how to manage disease, interact, like potential interactions with food and drugs. Whereas a nutritionist, anybody can call themselves a nutritionist. You can take an online certification course, usually they're 3 hours. And that is the extent of that.
Yeah. So you compare like 4 years with like 3 hours of online course.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a very heavily science-based degree. We go through organic chemistry, microbiology, anatomy and physio, and then medical nutrition therapy are their own courses. Food science, that's another fun one. And so nutritionists are not required to do any of that other than just a 3-hour course.
Yeah. So what is the difference, let's say, in the services?
In the services, this is a recognized credential, registered dietitian, just like registered nurse or, MD. But we specifically work with, disease management through nutrition, medical nutrition therapy. We are credentialed to work in hospitals, long-term care facilities, community organizations like health departments. On a federal level, we can work in public health, research, private practice.
Mm-hmm.
Our credential really affords us the ability to move and work in any industry, whereas a nutritionist would not have any of those opportunities. They can certainly make a name for themselves on social media, as can anyone else. And some of them might be okay, but they are not trained the way registered dietitians are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's far more rigorous, it's very rigorous what we have to go
Yeah.
through.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know, because seemingly both are about diet, nutrition, but then you can see how big is the difference in the training, time, effort that is put in each of them. Okay. Is there something that you would want to leave the listeners with?
I think I mentioned it earlier, and it's just be curious about yourself.
Yeah.
What is your genetic potential? What can you really achieve in this lifetime? Would you want to, when you're reflecting back on your life, what would be your regrets,
Yeah.
in terms of everything, your dreams, in terms of being successful, health wise, if you have a dream, just pursue it and
Yeah.
really find out from your cellular level up, what is your potential.
Yeah. Oh, I love this. This is so much fun. And I didn't even notice how time flew by.
The time went by really fast. I really enjoyed our talk too. You asked some great thought-provoking questions.
Well, that's my goal. So check, I guess.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.